Hi, everybody. I'd like to briefly introduce the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer and to talk a little bit about her overarching rhetorical strategy and to give you an illustration using one of the chapters of how you're going to find the quote unquote argument in each one of her chapters. So, first off, this book was published in 2013, and since its original publication, it's made a kind of slow and steady rise to fame. It made the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list in January of 2020. So it's slowly but surely gained a following, a wide readership and a wide following of Kimmerer's. I think not only her ideas that she brings in this book, but also her writing style. I think many of you are going to recognize that she's a poet as well as a scientist. And so she's got some very beautiful sentence constructions, some really great kind of uses of metaphor. And I think you all are going to be able to identify those as you're reading the book as well. So we're going to read selected chapters. We're not going to read the entire book, but as you're reading each chapter, I want you to be kind of thinking about the stuff that we're talking about here in this video, and helping using this video to kind of help you uncover the argument that she's making in each one of her chapters. So first off, let's talk about the preface. So if we go to the very opening of the book, you're going to notice that she opens the book with the story of Sweetgrass, right? And that's a reference to her title as well, and this notion of braiding the sweetgrass. And she basically brings us a rhetorical question here. She says, "Will you hold the end of the bundle while I braid? Hands joined by grass, can we bend our heads together and make a braid to honor the earth?" And that's exactly what she's inviting her readers to do, is to come together and figure out how we can honor the earth through these stories. She says, "I offer," and here's her stated intention and then her stated purpose. She says, "I offer a braid of stories, and that braid is comprised of three strands, of course, indigenous ways of knowing, scientific knowledge, and then the story of an Anishinaabe scientist trying to bring them together." And what she's hoping is that through these stories that they become a medicine for our broken relationship with the earth, and to basically kind of come to this idea that the people and land are good for each other. So in that preface, she really kind of sets up her intention and her purpose. And when we get to her first chapter, then we see her bringing these three elements together. So the three elements that she talked about in her preface, she talks about these three strands of the braid: indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teaching of plants. And as you go through each chapter, I want you looking for each one of those strands and try to see how she is. I think as I was pulling it apart here to annotate this chapter here for you all right now, I was really noticing how interwoven these three strands are. And so really kind of pay attention to how she's weaving these things together in each chapter. To really offer us an argument. Sometimes that argument is going to be implicit or implied, and sometimes the argument is going to be explicit or stated directly. You can actually underline it. So in this first chapter here, there are kind of three key terms that she's going to continually reference: this idea of teachings, wisdom, and story. And so she opens this chapter with the story, the indigenous creation story of Sky Woman falling. Some of you may be familiar with this story. She's writing to a Western audience, and so she's assuming that they don't know the story. And so she gives us a lot of detail about this story, and kind of tells us what version she's using here. So when she's done giving us that story, I put a little note here that she's done with that story. When she is done giving us that story, then she moves on to kind of reference back to her purpose here. And we see her again referencing this relationship between humans and the earth. And she makes the case that people who were raised on this story, so people in her culture, know about the responsibility between humans and earth. And she wants to share that story with other people outside of her community so that we can all go forward. And then we move on to where she starts to braid in some of her scientific knowledge. And she opens opens that discussion with kind of referencing her own kind of work as an individual. She's a botany professor, and she talks about how she gave one of her sections a survey, and everybody in the class said that humans and nature were a bad mix. And of course, she kind of talks about all the ways, she understands why they would think that, right? With all the negative interactions that they are well versed in, right? So climate change, toxins in our water and land, habitat loss. But then she asked this question, the rhetorical question: how can we ever move towards sustainability? Because in fact, that's what her students are studying to kind of become experts in environmental sustainability. So how can we ever move there if we can't imagine a path in which humans and the land are working together? And then she kind of sets up this idea that these students don't know the story of Sky Woman. They were raised on a different story. And here's where she's really careful to acknowledge her audience, and we see here that she's using this mode of development, compare contrast, and she really wants to kind of show the different worldviews between an indigenous culture and a Western culture. And there's no judgment here. She's really kind of careful with how she uses parallel sentence construction and repetition to just say that we had different stories. So one side of the world had the story of Sky Woman, the other side of the world had the story of Eve, and she references the biblical story of Eve in the Garden of Eden. And she talks about how these origin stories kind of shape who we are, and kind of makes kind of a very kind of explicit statement there about the lesson that people who are receiving these stories learn from each one of their creation stories. And so one is an ancestral gardener and the other is an exile. So she offers this kind of different worldview of how we imagine ourselves in the place that we live. And then she moves on to kind of getting into this notion that kind of bringing the wisdom that she has from Sky Woman, from the Sky Woman story, which is that the other species, in fact, are a lifeboat for the people. And then making the case that now we have to kind of flip sides, and now we as humans have to be the lifeboat for other species on the earth. And then she moves into this notion of really kind of establishing kind of common ground with her audience. And so she's really trying to build ethos here. And we see her using this repetition of the word immigrant. We're going to see her carefully using that word 3 times. And then we kind of see her really inviting readers to kind of become indigenous. So she invites them into her own worldview. She talks about the original immigrant becoming indigenous and inviting all of us to become indigenous. And then finally, we get back to this comparing and contrasting again between these different worldviews. So the Western worldview that's raised on the kind of Eve's exile from Eden, and then the kind of play of words that she has here of using her original creation story, her culture's creation story, and playing with that notion of ecological restoration, and calls it restoration. So a play on words there to really kind of emphasize the importance of storytelling as a means to heal the earth. And finally, she gets to her kind of final argument here in this chapter. This notion that the plants are the oldest living species, right, on the planet, and they should be our teachers. And so that's going to be kind of what she tries to establish now in the rest of the book. So when we look at her kind of chapter on the Council of Pecans, if we're thinking about those 3 things again, so remember, we're looking for indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teaching of plants, and all kind of told through story. We see the stories that she's kind of bringing together here and weaving together in this chapter. The story of her grandfather collecting pecans, the story of her tribe's decision to become United States citizens, and then the story, I put that in quote marks, the quote unquote story of the botany of the pecan trees. So this notion that the pecan trees, kind of how they survive, and this notion of massed fruiting. And so throughout this chapter, she's going to be weaving these things throughout the story. And I'm just going to briefly, I want you guys to kind of uncover this as you're reading through this, really kind of looking for the argument. You're going to see that each one of these three elements, kind of what her grandfather kind of experienced, this whole notion of the Indian Removal Act, and then the United States government's kind of treaty with the native tribes, and the native tribes had to decide whether or not they wanted to join the treaty, but basically to have them become United States citizens, and whether or not that was a good decision or not. And then this notion of pecan trees and how they communicate with each other in mass fruiting. Everything is connected here with this notion, this word of unity. So kind of pay attention to how she's really trying to kind of highlight the importance of working together. Council, so pay attention, council people coming together to kind of come to a decision. So she talks about the council of the pecan trees, right? But she's also kind of referencing the council of her native people and their decision to trying to decide whether or not to take up the offer by the United States government to become citizens. So when she gets down into here, I'm kind of scrolling, looking quickly for that, when she talks about the kind of Indian Removal Act, and then this notion of the federal government coming with a treaties that would kind of stop the kind of constant migration of her people for them to become citizens. So she weaves in that story. And then, of course, in a very kind of beautiful move here, she talks about the historic council being called a pecan grove. And then she brings us back to this notion of the wisdom in the pecan trees, and how they show a capacity for concerted action, for unity of purpose that transcends the individual trees. And she's really kind of highlighting how her people didn't learn that lesson. They didn't work together. They all became individual private owners of land rather than collectively owning the land, and the kind of destruction that kind of ultimately happened for her culture. And she says that the pecan trees know this lesson, right? They stand together and then survive. Here's where we now kind of see her doing a little bit of wordplay. She talks about the trees having a council. So council is more of an action that humans would do. And then she flips that around later on, and she talks about human beings having the massed year. So the massed fruiting is something the pecan trees had done, and now she's talking about the massed fruiting of her own family. So she kind of does a little bit of a word play there. And then I just want to highlight just a few more little things. I know this video is getting pretty long. Here's where we get her explicit argument. Through unity, survival, all flourishing is mutual. This notion of reciprocity it becomes a really key term throughout the rest of the book. This idea of making sure that what we take, we give back, right? And so we always are kind of reciprocal in our kind of use of land and the land's use, what the land offers us, and then we offer the land back. So this notion of reciprocity she introduces it here and becomes a really important notion as you move through the rest of the book. Okay, let's see. I finally have this notion here, that notion of unity here that she's talking about earlier on. This idea that working together, working together, and this idea of uniting people through both your ancestors and your children's, this connection of history. And she says, as a nation, we are beginning to follow the guidance of our elders. Follow the guidance of our elders, the pecans. As a nation, we are beginning to follow the guidance of our elders, the pecans, by standing together for the benefit of all. I think there's a word missing there. For some reason, that's not making sense to me. We are remembering what they said, that all flourishing is mutual. And so there's where we have that kind of argument that she's kind of explicitly states at the end. Okay, you guys, I hope this video really kind of helps you as you move through the rest of the book and reading I should say the rest of the chapters that we're reading, really kind of paying attention to these three key elements and trying to see what the stories, kind of what I've outlined here. I've kind of outlined the kind of different stories that she's weaving through that ultimately help us get to her argument. In this case, the notion that unity, all flourishing is mutual, right? We work together in order to flourish. Okay, that's it, you guys. We'll talk soon. I hope you enjoy the book.